What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. Randy and I just got done with a shallow versus offshore challenge on Grand Lake. We're going to explain how we caught our fish and how you can prepare for fall fishing. Let's get into it. Okay, Randy, so walk us through how you caught your fish today.
Well, you know, my plan today was just to be junk fishing. I mean, it's sort of what I do down here this time of year, you know, mid-fall, that type of thing. The lake has been getting hammered by tournaments on all the obvious stuff. So I know the lake well enough where I figured I could run just a dock here, a lay down here, a rocky point here, and do pretty good. And that's the way I wound up fishing. You know, I was staying in shallow water, just keying in on, you know, whatever was in the area that I was fishing. And I started out this morning throwing that Megabass Z2, the crankbait I've been fishing all summer, if you guys have been watching me here. Just around those flatter rocky points, mixing it up with the top water a little bit. I caught my first keeper on the Z2 just on like a gravelly point. And then I had about a 4-pounder hit my top water, which that turned out, I wish I wouldn't even have that bite because it got me on a wild goose chase at throwing the top water for the next couple hours, and I just couldn't get anything going on it. It's like those fish did not want to come up on it. So I messed around, fished points a little bit more, then I decided I wanted to go to some isolated wood. And I started picking up, the SV3 Megabass spinnerbait, half-ounce model, had a Zoom Z-Craw Junior trailer behind it, and I was throwing it around isolated wood on these shallow flat banks. And right off the bat, I caught one that weighed 3 pounds and 10 ounces. You know, just nice, chunky, solid fish. And I knew where a lot of stuff like that was, so I figured I could run it and run it and run it and do pretty good. So I started fishing that type of stuff. Couldn't get bit. About an hour later, I came onto another laydown, just about very similar to the one I lost that big one in. And I slow rolled the spinnerbait over the side of the log, let it drop down, and a big one got it, like a 4-pounder. Got me hung up in the limbs, you know, got it out of in the open water. It came up to the surface, busted the surface, and came off. So then, you know, I mixed it up, you know, wood, shallow rock, and I couldn't get anything going. So I've got 2 fish. We've got like 30 minutes left to fish. So I said, man, I'm just gonna put on the Megabass Vision 110, you know, my signature bait. And I started running docks and seawalls, caught a couple small ones, and then I hooked about a 3-pounder, fought it forever on this break wall, and it came loose right at the boat. I could see it when it came by the boat. It was just hooked by the back hook. Very next cast I threw out there and caught another nice one, like a 2¼ pounder on the 110, and then it was time to come in. So for me, man, it was just a day of junk fish and just fishing whatever, you know, I came up upon.
Well, I noticed a couple unique things about your baits. One, that Vision 110 looks pretty customized there. Can you walk us through a little bit about what you had going on there with that bait?
Well, this one, this is the Deadly Black Shad pattern, which is one of my favorite colors in a little bit off-colored water. But you know, as far as this particular one hasn't been modified, but I do modify them quite a bit. One of the things that I really like to do is I paint red gills on all of them in a tournament situation. A lot of times I'll take sandpaper, sand the side, you know, dull the finish up a little bit, yeah, and replace the hooks with it sometime. And depending upon the situation, I may be weighting it or not. Yeah. So, but we'll cover a lot of that. We got a jerkbait seminar coming up. We're gonna go into details of bait modifications. But yeah, like I said, mid-fall, great time to fish a jerkbait. Don't discount it this time of year.
And then I also saw on that spinnerbait, you probably wanted me to just pass this by without saying anything, but you got a unique skirt on that spinnerbait that I noticed. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, this is old school. A lot of times in this dirty water, like in Oklahoma, you know, I like the old school rubber skirt on there. No one throws it much anymore, and you know, I replaced the stock skirt that was on this with the rubber skirt. And sometimes if you're dealing with water visibilities, you know, 12 inches deep, and when those fish are on shallow wood, a lot of times, there's something about that live rubber that's just a lot more lifelike in the water. So it's sort of something just us old dudes do once in a while still. Yeah, that's the SV3 Megabass, half-ounce, Z-Craw Junior Zoom trailer on it, and just the old stock rubber skirt, chartreuse and blue.
That's a cool trick there. And it seemed like you were getting some pretty good quality bites, though the numbers weren't quite there. Is that typical for you in the fall on Grand Lake?
Well, you know, typical this time of year. I mean, if you catch a 13 or 14 pound bag, you know, you've had a pretty good day in this time frame. I mean, there's always somebody that, you know, catches an upper teens bag. But today, you know, I had 3 that weighed 7.5 pounds. And I lost the 4 and the 3 that I saw, so that would give me another 7. So, you know, I should have had, you know, 14, 15 pounds if I'd have just landed those 2 fish, which would have been a really good bag. I'd have been happy with that. But looking back, you know, what I would have done differently, the area that I fished today, which was mid-lake, normally you've got, you know, 8 inches, 12 inches of visibility. I got down there today and it was like this much visibility. It was like 2.5 feet. Wow. And that's why I spent so much time with the topwater. And in hindsight, once I saw how clear that water was, I should have went farther up the river and started hunting that dirty water for that shallow cover with that spinnerbait. Because I really think they want a spinnerbait right now. You know, feeding on those bigger threadfin gizzard shad. It's a really, when that water temperature starts to get down, you know, in the 60s, upper 60s for the first time, there's a window there that those big fish will get on a spinnerbait really good. And we're real close to it right now.
And when do you feel like that switches? Because right now water temperatures are like 70 degrees. It's still like 85 degrees outside right now, but we've had some cooler nights, some cooler days. Is it really when you get that first cool period of the year that you go to the spinnerbait? Yeah,
you know, in earlier fall, late summer and early fall, I'm using a square bill quite a bit. And you know, if y'all have seen many of our past shows, you know I've caught a lot of fish on the square bill, but once you start getting shorter daylight hours, you know, you start getting those nights sometimes down in the 50s. And you just start slowly moving into the fall transition. For me, they'll get off the square bill a little bit, and they start to get on a spinnerbait a little bit more on shallow water cover if you've got less than 2 foot of visibility.
Got it. That makes sense. Well, I did the opposite today. I went offshore as usual, and I actually managed to catch a limit, which was kind of surprising given how tough the fishing on Grand can be offshore this time of year. And especially since we only fish for like maybe 5.5 to 6 hours. I ended up with 5 fish for 10.5 pounds, so notching our W for the offshore angler.
Another buck kicking here. I can't beat Johnny. He's just like, he's impossible to beat. He's like KVD Jr., man.
Well, it's only when I go offshore, but it's interesting because I started the day by fishing actually right out here in the middle of the Horse Creek Bay area, and I just graphed out in the middle looking for brush piles. There's actually some house foundations out here, and I'll show some clips on my side imaging as well as on my new 360 imaging of these house foundations, and there were fish all over them. Shad, I could have fish busting around me, but this morning we had that cloud cover, and I feel like that was really conducive for the shallow water bite like you were doing, and you were able to capitalize on that with a couple of good bites. Offshore though, whenever you get the cloud cover, especially in the fall, it's not as big of a deal in the summer, but in the fall when they're really keyed in on bait fish, those fish will spread out and roam on offshore structure and offshore cover. And I could see fish on my live scope, on the 360 imaging, just roaming around these house foundations, brush piles, whatever I was fishing out there. And for the first 2.5 hours, I could not buy a bite out there. And I knew I was around fish, you could just see them, but they were so keyed on those shad that I couldn't actually get a bait in front of them to get them to bite. I actually found a roadbed even that was just, I'll show it on the recording here, it was stacked. 15 foot of water, right on the break of this old like culvert that was down there. It was incredible. I thought I was gonna hammer them. I threw a swim bait, hair jig, flutter spoon, Neko rig, football jig, everything, even a giant crankbait, small crankbait, couldn't get a bite there. And after about 2.5 hours of doing that, I just realized I could not get those offshore fish, like really far offshore fish to bite. I thought if I could get one of those schools of fish to trigger, I could get a 15 to 20 pound bag. That's where you catch the big ones this time of year. And after determining I couldn't get a lot of bites out in the middle of the lake on those house foundations and the brush piles, I decided to start looking a little bit further back in the flats. And I actually did catch one keeper, my first keeper, on a Megabass Deepex 200 LBO, firing it over like a 7-foot rocky point that was sticking off the bank. And there's a little brush pile off the tip of it. There's shad all over it. And I caught one doing that right away. But then after that, I really didn't get any more bites. I tried a few more areas like that for about an hour. And basically I had one fish in the boat and was struggling. Didn't really know what to do. But fortunately, right around that time, the sun popped out. And I knew that whenever that sun pops out, I can pick up the fish the moment offshore jig and go to work. And you guys know I catch a ton of fish on the Jewel Fish the Moment offshore jig. I designed this bait, and what I basically decided to do was change areas of the lake. I wanted to run out to the main lake, try to find some different spots and fish this football jig to try to put some fish in the boat. My initial plan was to try to go to a creek that was a little bit smaller than Horse Creek, actually a lot smaller. Horse Creek is kind of like its own lake almost. And instead, I wanted to find a creek that was no more than maybe 200 yards long. And what happens in the fall is that bass will tend to start transitioning from the main lake back into the creeks, setting up on main lake points and secondary points in like 8 to 15 foot of water. And so I picked a smaller creek that I could just graph the whole thing. And actually on the first main lake point I pulled up on, you could see the fish stacked up all over the graph. Fired out there, got one of my first cast. After establishing that I'd get some bites on this jig on main lake points, I tried to duplicate that. Started graphing a bunch of other main lake points, also graphed a little bit into the creeks and tried to see if there were fish that had moved a little bit further back. And it took me like an hour and a half to find another spot that was good. And again, we only fished for 5.5 hours, so between the 2.5 hours I didn't get a bite this morning, the hour, maybe 45 minutes I spent finding that first point, and then the next hour and a half, I had like an hour left to fish when I finally found the second area. And today I probably graphed for 2.5 to 3 hours and fished for about 2.5 hours.
You know, I'm really surprised that, you know, you said you caught a number of non-keepers and the keepers you caught were 2-pounders.
Yeah.
So that surprises me, in that deep of water you didn't get hit by a good one. I mean, do you find that typical this time of year?
Yeah, it's really weird because if you find fish schooled up offshore this time of year, they're usually going to be smaller fish. They're not going to be 3 and 4 and 5 pounders. I did get one fish that was in that 2.5 pound range, 2 3/4 pound range on the Netco rig, but most of the time when you find them grouped up in, let's say, more than 5 to 10 fish schools, they're going to be smaller fish. In the summertime, a lot of times when you find a school, you can catch really big ones and numbers of them. What I find instead in the fall is that if you're going to get that big bite, that 5, 6, 7 pound bite, even a 4 pound bite, you need to find fish on isolated pieces of cover, whether that's a brush pile, a log jam underwater, a house foundation. And that's why I spent so much time out here in the middle in the morning fishing that type of stuff, because usually that's how you're going to get your bigger bite. The points that I was fishing, those main lake points, that's kind of like a backup pattern that I use sometimes as like just to fill out my limit and to catch fish. But if I'm trying to go for big ones all day, I won't really focus on those points with the groups of fish. I'll instead try to go for those isolated fish on those, you know, random pieces of cover.
Yeah, that, you know, it sounds like, you know, in looking at a lake like Grand Lake, it's like any lake that you have, like a popular lake like Grand Lake, or if you're fishing some of the TVA lakes, everybody knows they get hammered. I mean, this time of year, there's a lot of like end of the year tournaments, that type of stuff. And it's a grind if you're going to fish shallow. You've got to maximize the bites you get, like which I didn't today. You're fishing for those individual rogue fish, and you're so much ahead of the game if you can find something off the bank like you did. I mean, you just don't have to compete, you know, against those highly pressured fish. I felt today like I felt the bass I were catching today were very, very finicky and spooky and hot and educated. I mean, I just got that feeling, you know, that, you know, this lake had been getting hammered, and, you know, I lost those 2 good ones, which mean they were nipping at the bait. So, man, if you can get them offshore this time of year, that puts you so far ahead of everybody else.
Now, honestly, I feel like in the fall, you have to, if you can fish offshore, you have to mix up the shallow and the offshore game, because the conditions really dictate how these fish set up a lot offshore in the fall, more than they do in the spring and the summer. For example, this morning when we have all the cloud cover and stuff like that, those fish are going to roam a lot more. And I was actually this close to pulling out a buzzbait out of my rod box, start firing it down the bank, because I felt like with the conditions I could get a big bite on a buzzbait. And then I felt like when the sun came up, I could actually get those offshore fish to fire. And I feel like a lot of times when guys do well this time in the fall, it's a mixture of shallow plus offshore. It's not the shallow versus offshore where you do one all day. Instead, you kind of have to mix them together if you want to be really consistent in the fall. You can always go and have one really good day up shallow and pull up on a couple different banks and get some big bites. You can also do that offshore. You can pull up on the right house foundation or brush pile and catch some big fish. But if you want to consistently catch that 12 to 15 pound bag, I feel like being able to mix up shallow and offshore is really key.
Absolutely.
Well, at the end of the day, I still was able to take the W offshore, though 10 pounds isn't really a bragging bag on Grand Lake. I don't know how much longer my luck's going to hold. as we get further and further into the year, I think this offshore bite's going to get tougher and tougher. And once we get back into like January, you can definitely still catch them offshore, but the size, I feel like, starts moving shallower. The consistent, better bite is up shallow for size. Now for quantity, I still feel like from now all the way through March, you can catch a lot of numbers offshore, like I did today. But if you want to get those tournament caliber bags of fish, you need to be going up shallow, and I think we'll kind of see that play out as we keep doing these.
Yeah, and it's an interesting study because throughout our challenges this year, Johnny's consistently beat me off the bank. I mean, in my situation, if I would have maximized my bites 100%, then I'd have been right there with you and, you know, beat you in a couple events. But when you're fishing shallow like that, you can't afford to lose those good ones, and you have a little bit more of a cushion if you're fishing for those schools offshore if you mess up.
For sure, and I can find groups where I can spend 3 or 4 hours looking, and when I find them, I can catch them. And it's interesting because I feel like if you had 2 or 3 days of practice where you could actually find some good stretches and dial in the deal, I feel like a lot of times you might be able to beat me up shallow because the better quality a lot of times will sit up there shallower. Where offshore, even if I have a bunch of schools of fish found, I might not be able to compete with your quality up shallow. And so because we're finding our fish, we literally go out, guys, and just find these fish day of. We don't practice. We haven't been to Grand in how long has it been? A while.
No history on it recently at all.
Yeah, so it's not like we're going out here and practicing for this. We're just going out day of and finding them. And so it would definitely change, especially if we both had a day of practice. Now I'm sure some days it would help me if I had more time. I could do less graphing, more fishing, but at the same time it might help you as well. So we might want to do one of these challenges too, where we do a practice day one day and then do a tournament day. That might be kind of interesting.
Yeah, just the approach for the practice completely different than the tournament. But it's really an interesting study, you know, by us doing this, you know, all the time, into understanding how the seasonal movements of the bass actually take place, because we're fishing enough that we're witnessing that. We're witnessing the water temperature changes, the water level changes, and the personality and the mood of the fish. So it's going to be interesting following it all year.
For sure, and we're on Grand Lake today. It's kind of a little bit dirtier fishery. It's not dirty, but it's like, you know, 2 to 4 foot of visibility. And next week we're actually gonna be heading out into Beaver Lake, which is a lot more challenging, I feel like, than Grand, just for quality and consistency. And I think it's gonna be interesting to see how the shallow versus offshore plays there. I catch them pretty well in October offshore on beaver, so you might be still out of luck this time.
I'm gonna have to take advantage. I can't lose any, man. I gotta get every one of those bites in the boat next week.
But definitely on beaver, I know that most tournaments this time of year are 1 shallow, so you definitely have the opportunity. But I feel I'm pretty confident in the 10-pound bag out on beaver, but who knows? So that's fishing, we never know. But thanks again for checking out the video, guys. Hopefully you enjoy the shallow versus offshore challenge videos. If you do, leave a comment down below letting us know what you think. And also remember to check out some of our upcoming seminars on fishthemoment.com. Randy's gonna be doing a jerkbait customization and his full setup on how to pick the best style of jerkbait for different situations. Now I'm gonna be doing some advanced offshore bass fishing classes and advanced electronics classes so you can catch fish offshore like I did today. So thanks again for checking out the video. We'll see you all in the next one.